another way in which history can be useful, and that is in guarding us against alarms and fears, of hysteria, because that's how you get a public to do something that's against its interests. You get it afraid. You create a monster out there, and we're under attack, and then the public will go along with the most ridiculous things that the government proposes. Because we're seeing that now with terrorism. All you have to do is, and I mean, how many times has Bush used the word terrorism in each of his speeches? And terrorism, it's a war on terrorism. There are terrorists. And yes, terrorists are fearsome, and we should be. But there's a difference between a kind of rational assessment of a fear and a hysteria which leads you to do things which do not get at the root of that fear, but in fact expand the possibilities for that fear coming true. And the reason I say history is useful because we went through the same thing with communism. Communism played the role during the Cold War that terrorism plays now. And sure, communism was real, just as terrorism is real. There was a Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was occupying Eastern Europe. It was a dictatorship. It had all these qualities, right? But we took that reality and exaggerated it to the point where the Russians are coming. The Russians are coming. Hide under your desk. They're going to, really, remember the kids, hide nuclear weapon, nuclear. But it was the United States that was the great nuclear power. It was the United States that started it. It was the Russians trying desperately to catch up. They never caught up. All the way through, the United States was way ahead in the arms race, but presented the Soviet Union as a great threat. Only after the Cold War was over did the intelligence officials come out and say, you know, we really overassessed after $1 trillion had been spent, we overassessed the danger, you know, to the point where, yeah, after we had spent the wealth of this country on building up our military against a threat which never was that real. The Soviet Union and intelligence people from the CIA who had worked on the Soviet desk said, Soviet Union, there's no evidence the Soviet Union intended to invade Western Europe or they want to hold on to Eastern Europe. No, but everything became a communist threat. And that's why this communist threat became a way of justifying what we did in Latin America. Communism there, or justifying what we did in Vietnam. You know, oh, Vietnam, it's going to become communist. Well, what they meant was half of this tiny country, where the other half is already communist, the other half may become communist. And therefore, we should send an army over there. Hey, wait a while. There's China. China is communist. China has 1 billion people. And you're worried about half of this little country in Southeast Asia, and you're going to send an army and you're going to kill several million people because this is part of the world communist threat. We should have learned from our experience in the Cold War, but no, we're going through this with terrorism, scaring us into doing all sorts of things to our own liberty and our own economy and to the world, you see, which result in the deaths of huge numbers of people and the starvation of people and the ignoring of enormous problems that exist in the world because of the focusing on this war on terrorism. And so 1 billion people in the world can be without clean water and without food, and 14 million children can die every year for sickness that could be helped by the money that we are spending on war. But that all is put aside because we are dealing with terrorism and trying to make people forget or not learn that war is terrorism. War is terrorism. You know, there's the idea of a war on terrorism is a contradiction in terms. Because when you make war, you are guilty of terrorism. And not only that, but when you make war, you are magnifying terrorism. You are creating more terrorists because you are creating hostility in all of the places in the world that you're invading and bombing. And so war against terrorism is a huge fake, which they are still trying to promulgate on the American public. Fortunately, I believe, and this is a tribute to the common sense and decency of people, in spite of the government control of the airwaves, in spite of the television and media and their complicity with the government, American people have turned and turned and turned against the war and against the President George Bush, the so-called President George Bush.